light doesn't vanish all at once. It drains slowly from the sky, first into dusk, then into something deeper, more ambiguous. A blue-gray that makes the snowy clearing around your cabin seem to glow, while the tree line grows darker, denser, seemingly taller than at noon. You are carrying the last of the firewood now. Your breath forms short, visible clouds in the cold air, dissipating almost instantly. Your hands, inside worn gloves, are stiff, and the wood you stack against the cabin wall feels, to the touch, warmer than the iron-like chill of the axe handle you gripped an hour ago. The forest is about 50 yards from your door, closer in places where you haven't cleared all the stumps and underbrush. At this hour, just before full dark, the trees seem to lean in slightly, their bare branches forming intricate latticework against the fading sky. You pause, arms full of split logs, and listen. It's a habit now, this pausing to listen in the dusk. You're not entirely sure when it began, or why it feels necessary. The wind moves through the high branches, a sound like distant conversation. Words you can almost, but never quite, understand. Snow shifts somewhere in the woods. A clump of it falls from an overloaded branch. You tell yourself that, though the sound travels strangely, seeming to come along the ground rather than from above. Your dog, a lean mutt whose ribs are visible even with regular feeding, has settled himself near the cabin door. He isn't barking as a whining, but his ears are forward, his attention fixed on a point at middle distance, somewhere between the cabin and the woods, where the clearing darkens first. You stomp your boots on the threshold, knocking off packed snow, and push inside. The door is solid timber, thicker than needed for mere wind, hung on iron hinges your neighbor helped you install last autumn when the first hard frost came, when the people on this frontier land seemed to remember all at once that winter was coming. Inside, the cabin is already dim. Your wife has lit a lamp, just one, because oil must be rationed to last the long months when the supply wagons can't reach the settlement. It casts more shadow than light, creating small islands of visibility and letting the corners of the room feel distant, separate, like little territories outside the lamplighter's jurisdiction. The smell is always the first thing you notice after being outside. The smoke from the hearth, which never really draws properly despite your efforts to improve the chimney. The wet wool drying near the fire, a heavy, animal scent. The stored food, root vegetables in barrels, salted meat trapped in cloth. The faint sweetness of a string of dried apples hanging from a rafter. The cabin is about 16 by 20 feet. A single room that is kitchen, workshop, bedroom, the whole domestic world for your family through the entire winter. The ceiling is low enough that you could touch the beams without straining. The walls are chinked with mud and moss, which you'll have to replace come spring, as the logs shrink and swell with the winter's freeze and thaw, working the chinking loose, creating small crevices the cold air flows through like water through stone. Your wife moves between hearth and table, preparing the evening meal, and does not look up when you enter. She doesn't need to. She heard the thump of your boots on the threshold, recognized the particular rhythm of your movements, the sound of you stacking wood outside before you came in. Your two children, boys of 7 and 9, are already seated on the bench at the table, hands folded in their laps. They are quieter than they were in summer, quieter than they will be next April, when the days are long enough to suggest that plain noise are permissible again. You slide the bar across the door. It's not dramatic, not a moment of decision or fear, just part of the evening routine, like washing your hands or taking off your coat. The bar is a length of oak, seated into iron brackets set on either side of the doorframe. It settles into place with a solid thunk, marking the formal transition from day to night, from outside to inside, from activity to stillness. The shutters are already closed over the two small windows, latched from the inside. You made those shutters yourself from what you otherwise would have hated to use, because unprotected windows felt too much like a vulnerability, like eyes that could be seen through in both directions. At night, you prefer walls to be walls, solid and unambiguous. The meal is simple. A thin soup made from dried beans, a few pieces of salted pork for flavor, bread that is denser than you'd like, because the flour must be made to stretch. You eat slowly, not quite savoring, but prolonging the act. Because after the meal, there is nothing to do but wait for sleep. Talk is sparse. Your wife mentions a shirt that needs mending for one of the boys tomorrow, says she's running low on thread. Perhaps you might remember to buy more when the supply wagon comes in the spring. You nod, filing this away with the 100 other minor necessities that accumulate to the winter like snow on the roof. Each one light, but together, they represent a weight that must be considered. The boys eat without complaint, without the fidgeting and questions of summer meals. They have learned, as all frontier children do, that winter imposes a stillness on the body and mind, a conservation of energy not entirely equivalent to sadness but sharing some of its qualities. After the meal, your wife clears the wooden bowls and spoons, washing them in water heated by the hearth. You sit by the fire, not reading. Books are scarce, and the light is too dim and too precious to waste on reading in the evenings. Just sitting, hands on your knees, eyes on the flames as they consume the wood you split this afternoon. The fire is the heart of the cabin, the sole source of heat and light, not subject to careful rationing. It burns continuously from October through March, never allowed to go completely out, because starting a new fire with flint and steel in the deep cold is difficult, and you'd rather wake every few hours to add wood than face a cold hearth in the morning. The boys settle into their sleeping pallets earlier than they would in summer, wrapped in wool blankets that have been in your wife's family for 2 generations. They don't ask for a story tonight. Some evenings you tell them things, stories from your own childhood, fragments of history, simple fables with obvious morals. But tonight they seem to understand without being told that it is a quiet evening, a time for listening rather than speaking. Your wife joins them soon after, lying down but not asleep, her eyes open, reflecting tiny, steady points of firelight. You stay by the fire as you do most nights, because someone needs to tend it, and because you find, with each passing winter, that sleep comes less willingly, as if your body is slowly forgetting how to rest completely in the dark months. The cabin settles around you with small sounds, the creak of logs contracting with the cold. The occasional pop and crackle of the fire as sap left in the wood expands and bursts. The rustle of straw in the mattress as someone shifts position. Outside, the wind picks up a little, circling the cabin, making the building feel almost like a vessel, a small craft of warmth and light, afloat on an ocean of dark and cold. Then from somewhere beyond the wall you hear it. Not loud, not close, but clear enough that there is no mistaking what it is. A long, rising howl beginning low and climbing upward, then cutting off, leaving a silence that feels heavier than the sound. You don't move. Your wife doesn't move. The boys go completely still, their breathing almost inaudible. The dog, lying by the door, lifts its head, ears pinned back. But it does not bark, does not growl, does not make any sound at all. This is the beginning of the night, as you have come to know it. And not the darkness itself, but the things that travel through it. The things that use the darkness as a medium, that send their voices across frozen ground and bare trees. Howl comes again, this time answered from a different quarter. Further away, a second voice, lower in pitch, more of a statement than a question. You have heard wolves before, in fact most nights this winter, and you know they aren't immediately at the door. They are likely back at the tree line, maybe further, using the woods as cover, moving across their territory, or communicating across distances that would take you an hour to walk. But knowing this does not change the fact of their presence, does not change the way their voices reshape the night into something that feels inhabited, watched, as completely yours than it did when you barred the door. You add another log to the fire, not because you need to, but because the act of moving, of doing something purposeful, helps you focus your attention on the present space of the cabin, rather than letting it drift toward the sounds outside. The bark catches quickly, the flames spreading over the new wood, creating both more light and more shadow, making the interior of the cabin feel both more protected and more isolated. Time passes differently after dark in winter. Without the sun's position or the rhythm of work as reference points, without the natural division between morning tasks and afternoon chores, time seems to stretch and compress unpredictably. Sometimes 15 minutes feels like an hour. Sometimes you look up and realize 2 hours have passed while you sit motionless watching the fire, listening to the night outside. The howling continues intermittently, sometimes a single voice, sometimes two or three, forming a chorus that rises and falls in a pattern you can almost, but never quite predict. The sounds are not constant. They come in waves, punctuated by long silences that might be 15 minutes, might be 40 minus 5. You stop trying to measure. During the silences, you listen more intently, because somehow the absence of sound feels more significant than its presence, as if the wolves are choosing when to announce themselves and when to move quietly. Your mind begins its familiar nighttime work, slowly cataloging the sounds and their possible sources. That creak is just the cabin logs. That soft thump is snow sliding off the roof. That distant crack is a branch breaking under the weight of ice. You have learned the soundscape of the winter night, separating the ordinary from the potentially worrisome. But you also realize the skill is not perfect. Your readings are educated guesses, not certainties. The wind shifts direction, and you hear the howling more clearly now, close enough to distinguish individual voices. To hear one wolf begin, another join a little later, creating a brief dissonance before they align. Your wife sits up slowly, carefully, trying not to disturb the boys, though you suspect they aren't asleep either, just lying with their eyes closed, as children do when they are afraid and don't want to admit it. She looks at you across the dim cabin, and you exchange no words, no gestures, just a look that acknowledges what you are both thinking. They are closer tonight than last night. This is how it is. The wolves, deep in winter, begin the season at a distance from comfort, in deeper woods, where their presence is theoretical rather than immediate. But as the weeks pass and food becomes scarce, the deer herds thin, the smaller prey harder to find, the wolves' territory gradually expands. Their hunting patterns bring them closer to the settlements, to the edges of human habitation, where the scent of livestock, of dogs, of stored food, exerts a kind of gravity. You have never seen wolves attack a cabin. You have never heard of a wolf breaking down a door or clawing through shutters. But you have heard stories, third-hand accounts, rumors passed around at settlement, gathering stories of wolves taking livestock from poorly protected pens, of dogs that went out and never came back, of a man who left his cabin on a winter night for reasons no one could fully explain and was found 3 days later a quarter-mile into the forest. These stories are vague, likely exaggerated, perhaps entirely fabricated, but they exist in your mind nonetheless, adding weight to the persistent howling outside. Around midnight you only guess based on feel. The dog stands and goes to the door. He presses his nose to the crack at the bottom of the door, where a thin line of cold air seeps in. He inhales deeply, repeatedly, gathering information from the scents that drift across the clearing. His tail is low, not tucked, but cautious. When he exhales, his breath condenses into a small cloud of vapor that hangs in the air for a moment before dissipating. You watch him closely, because the dog's reactions are often more reliable than your own senses. He can hear frequencies you cannot, smell things you cannot see, and sense movement and presence with an acuity your human limitations cannot match. If he barked, you would be more concerned. Barking means an immediate threat, something close enough to require a defensive response. But this quiet attentiveness, this focused listening and sniffing, suggests the wolves are near but not pressing, present but not aggressive. Still, the dog does not return to his sleeping spot. He stays by the door, standing guard in his own way. You realize you are grateful for his presence, for this creature whose instincts are better adapted to the dangers of the winter night than your own. The boys eventually fall asleep. You can tell by the change in their breathing, by the way their bodies go completely slack, other than holding the tense stillness of feigned sleep. Your wife dozes intermittently, waking whenever the howling starts up again, her hand moving slightly under the blanket as if to grasp something. You stay awake, adding wood every hour or so, keeping the cabin warm enough that the cold does not become dangerous, but not so warm that you waste precious wood. The night continues to stretch, marked not by clock time, but by the rhythm of the wolves' calls in the silences, by the progression of the fire from bright flame to glowing embers and back to flame. You think about spring, about how it will feel when the daylight lasts long enough to complete a full day's work, about when the woods will become a place you can enter without careful planning and heightened vigilance, about when the nights will be short enough not to require this constant, low-level alertness. But spring is months away, February and March still to be endured, still to be survived. Around what you estimate to be 3 or 4 in the morning, the howling stops altogether, not gradually, not fading into the distance, but abruptly, as if a signal you couldn't hear was given. The silence that follows is deep, almost physical, and somehow more unsettling than the howling itself. When the wolves are howling, you know where they are, can estimate their distance and direction. When they are silent, they could be anywhere, moving soundlessly across the snow, repositioning themselves in ways you cannot track or predict. Do you sit perfectly still, listening to the silence, trying to hear beneath it, to detect any sound that might indicate movement or presence? The wind has died down too, leaving a near minus perfect stillness that makes even the crackle of the fire seem abrupt, too loud. Minutes pass, maybe half an hour. Silence holds, and gradually you feel some of the tension in your shoulders, in your jaw places you didn't realize you were holding tight begin to ease. Maybe they are gone. Maybe they found something more interesting than your cabin to follow through the winter night. You add another log to the fire, allowing yourself to consider sleep, to consider closing your eyes for a few hours before dawn demands your alertness again. Then the dog growls a low, sustained sound that comes from deep in his chest, almost subsonic. His eyes are fixed on the door, his body rigid. Every inch of him is focused on something you cannot see or hear. You stand slowly, moving toward the door but not touching it, not opening it, just positioning yourself to listen more carefully. At first, you hear nothing out of the ordinary. Then, very faintly, you detect what might be breathing, a slow, deliberate exhalation, so quiet it is almost masked by the ambient sounds of the night. Or perhaps it's just the wind picking up again, air moving through the chinks in the cabin's construction. You can't be sure. The dog's growl continues, steady and low, more a warning than a threat. You place a hand on his head, not to silence him, but to steady yourself, to maintain contact with something real and present as you try to make sense of what is happening outside the door. The breathing, if that's what it is, does not approach a retreat. It simply continues, patient and calm, as if whatever is outside has no need for haste, no urgency driving its actions. You realize your heart is beating harder, faster, though your body is motionless. This is the nature of winter night fear. Not panic, not terror, but a sustained, quiet anxiety that exists in the space between the known and the unknown, between what you can verify and what you can only imagine. The minutes accumulate. The dog's growl eventually subsides, though he does not relax, does not return to his sleeping spot. The breathing, if it was ever really there, merges into the general blur of night sounds, becoming indistinguishable from the wind, the settling snow, the creak of frozen wood. Slowly, so slowly you hardly notice the transition. The quality of the darkness outside begins to change. Not brighter, but less dense, less absolute. Dawn's edge is still hours away, but some subtle shift in the atmosphere suggests the deepest part of the night has passed, and you are beginning the slow climb back toward day. You return to your place by the fire, sit again, your body heavy with a fatigue you can feel but cannot quite yield to. Cabin is warm, your family safe, the door barred, the shutters closed, the fire burning steadily. These are facts, concrete and verifiable, but they coexist with another fact, equally true somewhere outside, perhaps close, perhaps far. Wolves are moving in the winter dark, and their presence shapes your experience of the night in ways that cannot be reasoned away or ignored. You will do this again tomorrow. You will bar the door at nightfall. You will tend the fire through the long hours. You will listen for the howls and the silences. You will measure safety in small increments, waiting for dawn with a patience that feels less like virtue and more like endurance. This is what it means to be a settler deep in winter when the wolves are close enough to be heard. This is the rhythm of your nights now, repeated infinitely until spring arrives and temporarily releases you from the cycle of vigilance and waiting. Fire burns down to embers again, and you add more wood, watching the bark catch and curl, watching the small flames spread across the new surface. Outside an hour or two from now, the first birds will begin to call, marking the approach of dawn with sounds that feel friendly, tame, safe. But that hour is not yet here. For now, there is only this: the warm cabin, the sleeping family, the patient dog, and the dark outside your walls that holds what it holds, gives away nothing, and waits with a patience that matches your own. For now, let us drift from the universal experience of a winter night toward a particular winter. A particular man whose words survive in fragments, brief entries in a worn ledger, letters sent but seldom answered, notes written by lamplight when sleep would not come. His name was Yakov Petrovich Morozov. Though in the settlement records he appears simply as Morozov, peasant, arrived 1807, cabin built on the northeast boundary, forest closest there. The ledger itself, now preserved in a regional archive, shows the wear of frequent use, the leather cover cracked along the spine, the pages darkened by smoke and time. Someone, perhaps Morozov himself, perhaps a family member, took care to preserve the book through multiple moves in the passage of years, recognizing the value in its sparse records, worth saving. He was not a writer by nature or training. His entries are plain, practical, focused on the weather, the work, and the small calculus of survival. How much firewood remains, how many days until the next supply run might be possible, whether the roof will hold under another heavy snow. The handwriting itself tells a story. The letters are formed with deliberate care, the occasional misspelling crossed out with a careful line, dates underlined for emphasis, as if to anchor each entry in time. It is the handwriting of a man for whom literacy represented an achievement, an education earned through effort, not birthright. But, interspersed with these practical records, appearing with increasing frequency as the winter deepens, are observations about the wolves. At first just brief mentions, almost casual, the way one might record the presence of wind or the quality of moonlight. The wolves enter his record as the weather enters it as a fact, a condition, an environmental element that influences daily decisions. There is no drama in these first mentions, no sense that they mark the beginning of anything significant. Then, as the season progresses, his attention, the space these observations take up on the page, shifts in a certain way. November 12, 1811. The first mention of wolves appears under this date, written in the careful hand of a man who learned to write late in life and still treats writing as a formal act, requiring focus and correct posture. He writes, "Heard wolves in the distant woods tonight." That is all. No elaboration, no emotion, just a fact recorded among other facts: the temperature at sundown, the amount of grain left in the barrel, or a reminder to repair the east corner of the roof before the next storm. In the context of November 12th, the note takes up perhaps a tenth of the page's space, sandwiched between more pressing concerns about winter preparations. The brevity is telling. Wolves in the distant woods common enough not to warrant detailed comment. By November 20th, his entries have developed a pattern. Each night's record includes a line about the wolves, their distance, their direction, whether a single call or many. Wolves to the north, voices of 3 or 4. Wolves near the creek bed, heard at midnight. No wolves tonight. Too windy perhaps. The observations remain factual, free of commentary, but their consistent presence suggests something: a new habit of attention, an acknowledgement that these sounds have become part of the architecture of his nights. He does not explain why he records these details, what purpose it serves beyond simple record minus keeping. Perhaps he didn't know himself at the time why he tracked them, why his pen recorded the howls with the same matter minus of minus factness as the snowfall or the number of eggs gathered. Practice precedes understanding, but the fact of the recording tells us how his consciousness was changing, how the wolves were moving from background to foreground in his nighttime experience. December arrives, and his entries grow slightly longer, as if the shortened days and lengthened nights create more time for writing, or perhaps more need for a way of marking time, of giving shape to what otherwise feels formless and slow. The lengthening of the entries coincides with the period of deepest cold, when the sun barely clears the tree line before beginning its descent, when morning chores blend directly into evening preparations with little noon in between. In such conditions, time itself becomes strange. measured not by clocks but by tasks, by cycles of adding wood and darkness. December 3, 1811. Heavy snow this morning. Cleared by afternoon. Managed to split half a cord before dark. Wolves came very close after nightfall, perhaps at the clearing's edge. Dog would not settle. Maria asked if we should be concerned. I said no, though I am less certain in my heart than I pretended. This is the first entry of emotion into his record, the first admission that the wolves represent something beyond simple fact. His uncertainty is understated, almost apologetic, as if he is embarrassed by his own worry. That it is there now, visible on the page, and once admitted, begins to appear more frequently in subsequent entries. The admission of uncertainty marks a turning point, not in the wolf's behavior, which likely remained consistent, but in Morrisop's willingness to acknowledge and record his own reaction to that behavior. The environmental becomes focal, the noted becomes the felt. December 9th. Wolves again, closer than before, could hear them moving in the brush near the woodpile. Did not go out to look. Maria says the children are sleeping poorly. December 14th. Tracks in the snow this morning. About 20 feet from the door. Large prints. Several animals. They circled the cabin sometime last night. I reinforced the chicken coop. The decision not to go out, not to open the door to those sounds in the dark, represents a kind of wisdom born of frontier experience. One does not chase wolves at night with a lamp and an axe unless the situation demands it. December 18th. Neighbor Pietro from down the line came at midday to borrow an axe. He mentioned wolves took the chickens from his enclosed pen. He seemed more angry than worried. Said he would organize a hunt when the snow was harder in January. I nodded but said nothing. I'm not sure killing them would accomplish much. His entries from late December into early January form a kind of narrative, though he likely did not intend it. Just a series of observations that accumulate into something larger, a portrait of how the persistent, close presence of wolves reshapes daily life and nightly routine. The narrative emerges by accident, as any sustained attention to a single theme will produce meaning over time. Morozov was recording the days. What we read a century later is a story. January 2, 1812, the new year came, and we marked it quietly. No visitors. The roads are impassable. The wolves come every night now, sometimes in the early evening, before full dark. The children no longer ask about the sounds. They know what makes them. The children's silence says everything. This is how fear becomes normalized. The extraordinary becomes ordinary through repetition. The adults no longer need to explain or reassure, because the situation has become the condition of winter. January 7th, a long night. The wolves began at sundown and continued past midnight. At one point, I counted 5 distinct voices, maybe more. Maria sat with me by the fire. We did not speak much. There was nothing to say. January 11th. I have begun keeping the axe within reach of the door. Dorian noticed but did not comment. The dog now sleeps by the door. He moves there once we bar it for the night. He knows something we perhaps do not allow ourselves to fully acknowledge. The dog's behavior is confirmation of instinct, confirmation of an animal understanding operating beneath human rationalization. Morozov notes it with a kind of respect. The dog's honesty about danger is something humans, with their need for courage and composure, cannot fully afford. January 15th. I walked to Pietro's cabin today to return his axe. Snow deep, walking difficult. He offered tea and we sat by his fire, his wife sewing in the corner. I asked if his wolves returned after the chickens were taken. He said no, then paused, corrected himself. They had not taken more chickens, but he heard them constantly through the night, sometimes in the evening. He asked me if I thought it was the same pack or different wolves. I could not answer. How does a man know? This question, how does a man know, appears again in a later entry suggesting it stayed with him, became something he turned over in his mind during the long watch hours. The question is about identification, about whether the wolves circling one cabin are the same as those circling another, about whether there is intention in their patter, nor merely instinct, hunger, the routine of territory. But beneath the surface question lies something deeper, a desire to understand what is watching you, to give identity and predictability to something fundamentally unknown. If these are the same wolves every night, then perhaps their behavior can be predicted, their movements planned for, their danger assessed and managed. If they are different wolves, then the forest contains an endless supply, and safety is more uncertain than it seems. Morozov carried this question with him through January, like a stone in a pocket, turned over and over during waking hours. January 22nd, 3 weeks now of constant presence. I sleep in fits, waking when the silences fall. The silence is worse than the howling. At least when they call, I know where they are. This observation that silence provokes more anxiety than sound reveals how completely Morozov has adapted to the wolves' presence. His nervous system has recalibrated, learning to track them through absence as much as through sound. January 28th. Maria asked me this morning why I am always listening. I did not realize it was so obvious. He said, "You stop mid-minus sentence, mid-minus task. Your head turns just slightly, as if you hear something I do not." I told her it was nothing, but the way she looked at me suggested she understood more than I said. She is listening too. Aria's noticing means the listening has become a visible behavior, something Morozov does unconsciously during the day. His attention is now divided between the task at hand and the auditory landscape beyond the cabin walls. Entries from early February show him in adapting to a new normal, finding ways to function within a situation that has become permanent rather than temporary. His observations become more detailed, more analytical, as if studying the wolves might give him some measure of control over their presence. February 3rd, I notice a pattern in their howling. They seem to make a large circle around the settlement, visiting near each cabin on successive nights. They called from the south last night, likely east tonight, near Koselov's place. Tomorrow perhaps they will be gone. Give us a quiet night. Or perhaps this pattern I perceive as imaginary, imposing meaning where there is none. February 9th. Snow fell particularly heavy this week. Wolf tracks everywhere around the cabin, near the barn, along the path I cut to the woodpile. During the day, I sometimes follow these tracks, see where they lead. Usually, they circle and return to the woods. Once they lead to a spot about 30 feet from my door where the snow was packed down, as if something had lain there for a time, waiting or resting. Stood in that spot and looked back at my cabin, saw it from the perspective of whatever had been there, the windows glowing faintly even in the afternoon, smoke visible from the chimney, the dog barking from inside. I wondered what that looks like to a wolf. What information is gathered from these signs of habitation? This moment, standing in the packed snow and looking back at his home through the eyes of the wolf, represents a leap of imagination, an attempt to bridge the gap between human and animal understanding. Morozov tried to see his cabin as a wolf might see it, a source of wolves, sound, movement, potential danger, or potential prey. The exercise brings no comfort, but it brings a different kind of knowledge, a recognition that his home is both fortress and beacon, both protection and advisement. Every light in the window announces presence. Every wisp of smoke charts human activity. February 16th. Piotr came again, this time with Koselov. Here still talking about a hunt. They want me to join. Say 3 men with guns is enough to drive the wolves further away. Maybe kill 1 or 2, as a warning to the others. They asked, what warning does a wolf take from the death of a companion? Piotr had no answer, but seemed annoyed by the question. Koselov said something about showing them we are not prey. I said I would think on it. After they left, Maria asked if I would go. I said no. She seemed relieved. The refusal to join the hunt marked something significant in Morozov's log, a recognition that violence against the wolves would not solve the problem that troubles him, because what troubles him is not the wolves themselves, but the way their presence has altered his relationship to the night, to his home, to the landscape, what he thought he understood when he chose to settle here. Patron to Koselov seek action, the satisfaction of responding to a threat, reasserting human dominance through firepower. Thezov has moved beyond that impulse, or perhaps never felt it strongly. His record suggests a man more inclined to observation than to conquest. He's expressed relief tells its own story. Perhaps she feared for his safety on such a hunt. Or perhaps she recognized, as he did, that killing the wolves would not restore the peace they had lost. February 24th, a strange night. The wolves came very close, close enough that I could hear their breathing between the howls, but they did not challenge the cabin, did not test the door or circle aggressively. They were simply there, present and patient. Once the howling stopped, I heard footsteps, soft, deliberate, moving along the north wall of the cabin. The dog heard it too, but did not bark, only pressed himself lower to the floor, staring at the door with a focus that suggested he knew something I did not. The footsteps passed. The howling resumed from further away. In the morning, the tracks in the snow showed what I had heard. A single wolf had approached the cabin, walked its length, then returned to where the others waited. This encounter, intimate yet non-violent, close yet controlled, seems different from the earlier circling and howling. A single wolf approached, investigated, then retreated according to some plan or instinct Morozov cannot decipher. The dog's response is equally cryptic. To not the barking of an animal defending territory, but the frozen alertness of an animal that recognizes something beyond its ability to challenge. Perhaps the dog sensed this wolf had no immediate intent to harm, or perhaps its simply knew barking would accomplish nothing. March 1st, the days are starting to lengthen. Not noticeably, but enough to be marked. Darkness falls at 5 now, not for -30. This small increase in daylight feels significant, like a promise winter will eventually release us. The wolves are still present, but seem less insistent, as if they too sense the change of season coming. March 8th, Kosel Ovi came to tell me he and Piotr went hunting 3 days ago. They tracked wolves for almost a full day, never got close enough for a clear shot. He had wanted to continue, but Kosel Ovi convinced him to return before dark. He said the experience gave him a new respect for how wolves move in the forest. Silent, efficient, always knowing where the men are. He laughed when he said it, but the laughter sounded uncertain. I think the hunt taught him something he did not expect to learn. Failed hunt becomes its own education. Not the lesson Piotr and Kosel Ovi intended to teach the wolves, but the lesson the wolves taught them about the limits of human mastery in that landscape. They entered the forest as hunters and returned as men who were constantly observed and defeated. Kosel Ovi's uncertain laughter suggests he understands the implications of this reversal, understands that the wolves weren't ever in danger because they knew, at every moment, where the men weren't how to stay just beyond rifle range. March 15th, I have been thinking about fear and how it changes over time. In November, when the wolves first began to howl at night, I felt a sharp, immediate anxiety that quickened my heartbeat, made me alert and tense. Now, 3 months later, the anxiety has dulled into something else. Not quite comfort, but an accommodation. The fear is still there, but it has become part of the background. Like the cold, the hunger, the ache in my back from splitting wood. I live with it rather than react to it. I am not sure if this is wisdom, or merely exhaustion. This reflection shows Morozov's characteristic honesty about his own mental state. He does not claim to have conquered fear, or become brave through exposure. He has simply become accustomed, learned to function under a constant, low-grade anxiety. His question whether this accommodation represents wisdom or exhaustion touches on something fundamental about frontier life, about how much of survival is simply endurance, the ability to keep going in the face of fear, cold, uncertainty, loneliness. Perhaps wisdom and exhaustion are not opposites but partners, to aspects of the same difficult accommodation. March 22nd, warmer today, snow melting in patches. The wolves were distant last night, their calls faint and sporadic. Maria commented she hardly noticed them. I realized I did. I always do, but the noticing has become automatic. No conscious effort required. They are part of the night now, familiar as the wind or the crackle of the fire. His final records of the wolves are brief, almost anticlimactic. 29 3 nights without wolves. The silence feels strange, almost unsettling. I find myself listening for them still. April 2nd, the wolves are gone, following the deer herds deeper into the forest as the snow melts and prey becomes more mobile. The dog sleeps in the corner again, not by the door. The children are louder, more active. Maria is planning her garden. Spring has come, though I find myself missing the structure winter imposed, the clarity of routine, the unambiguous line between inside and outside, the way each night had weight and meaning. Without the wolves, the nights feel empty, purposeless. I am not sure what this says about me. April 10th, I spoke with Piotr yesterday, and he mentioned the wolves casually, the way one mentions last season's weather, something that happened but is past. He has forgotten the intensity of January, the way the nights felt in the deepest cold. Or perhaps he has not forgotten, but chooses to set it aside, to treat it as an anomaly rather than a revelation. I find I cannot do that. The wolves are gone, but they change the way I inhabit this place. I understand now that the cabin is not truly mine, that the forest is not a backdrop but an active presence, that the border between human settlement and wild land is thinner than I imagined when I first arrived here. The recognition that the cabin is not truly his, that ownership is a legal fiction maintained only so long as the forest allows it, is the deepest understanding Morozov reaches through his winter with the wolves. He came to this land as a settler, a man claiming territory, imposing human order on a wild space. He emerges from the winter with a different understanding of himself, not as an owner, but as a guest, not as a conqueror, but as a tolerated presence. The wolves taught him this, not through aggression, but through patience, through their persistent presence at the edge of his cleared land, through their nightly reminder that the forest was here before him and will remain after him. This is the last entry that mentions the wolves. The remainder of the ledger, continuing sporadically into 1812 and early 1813, returns to practical matters, crop planning, repairs, the small commerce of frontier life. But the tone has changed slightly, become more reflective, more willing to acknowledge uncertainty. Morozov has lived through something many settlers experienced, but few could articulate the gradual transformation of fear into understanding. A recognition that sharing space with the wild requires not conquest, but negotiation, not victory, but coexistence. The practical entries in the ledger after the wolf winter carry the mark of this tonal shift. They are still concerned with survival and work, but they carry an undercurrent of awareness, a sense that every human action in this landscape is provisional, conditional, subject to forces beyond control or understanding. When Morozov writes of planting crops, there is an implicit acknowledgement that the weather, the wildlife, 100 other factors will determine the harvest. When he writes of repairing the cabin, a recognition that the structure itself is temporary, a brief imposition of order that will eventually return to the forest. This is not pessimism but realism, the hard -1 wisdom of a man who has stared into the dark and seen something staring back. In October 1813, Morozov wrote the final entry relevant to our story. The wolves have returned with the cold weather. I heard them last night, distant but clear. Maria asked if I was concerned. I told her no, and this time I spoke the truth. I'm not concerned. I'm merely aware. The wolves will circle the cabin as they did last year. They will howl in the dark and fall silent before dawn. They will leave tracks in the snow and move through the forest with an intent I cannot fully understand. And I will tend my fire, listen to the night, wait for spring, knowing this is the condition of living in this place, the bargain I struck when I chose to build my cabin where the forest presses close. It is not a comfortable arrangement, but it is an honest one. The wolves are not my enemies, they're my neighbors. Like all neighbors, we keep a cautious distance, respect each other's territory, acknowledge each other's existence without seeking deeper understanding or intimacy. This entry represents Morozov's final statement on the matter, neither triumphant nor resigned, but clear and accepting. He has reached an understanding with the wolves, or more accurately, an understanding of the wolves' indifference to human concerns. They are not enemies because they do not hate him. They are not friends because they do not know him. They are simply other creatures sharing the same landscape according to their own needs and patterns. The comparison to neighbors is apt. In frontier settlements, neighbors often lived far enough apart that they rarely saw each other, communicated mostly out of necessity, maintained politeness through distance. The wolves were exactly that kind of neighbor, acknowledged, respected, kept at a distance. The ledger ends in 1814 without any final statement or conclusion, just a last record of firewood stores. Morozov himself remained in the settlement until 1821, when records show he sold his property and moved to a town further south so his children could attend a proper school. The decision to leave came nearly a decade after the Wolf Winter was practical rather than dramatic. His children were growing, educational opportunities on the frontier were limited, and the relative prosperity of those years made relocation feasible. There is no indication the wolves influenced his decision, though one wonders if the understanding he reached that winter made it easier to let go, easier to accept that his tenure in that place was always temporary. There is no record of whether wolves troubled the new home, whether he missed those nights of listening and watching, whether some part of him remembered those winter months of 1811 and 1812, when he was most fully engaged with his life, alert, present, and aware of all that moved in the dark outside his door. What survives is his ledger, his careful records, his progression from fear through understanding to something like acceptance. The ledger itself passed through family hands, eventually donated to the archive in the 1892 by a grandson who recognized its historical value. By then, the frontier had moved west. The forest around the original settlement had been largely cleared. Wolves in the region had become scarce. The ledger was catalogued, preserved, consulted occasionally by historians interested in settlement patterns or the daily life of the frontier. But its true value lies not in the data it provides, but in the consciousness it reveals. One man's sustained attention to his own fear and accommodation. He was not a hero, did not vanquish or drive off the wolves. He simply lived through a winter of their proximity and recorded from the inside what that experience felt like. His words are quiet, understated, bearing the same steady patience as his nights by the fire. They tell us something dramatic narratives and heroic accounts cannot convey, that the truest frontier experience was often not about victory, but about endurance, not about conquering nature, but about learning to survive within it, about carrying fear without being destroyed by it, about listening to the night and hearing not just danger, but the complex reality of a world that existed before humans arrived and would continue after they were gone. The heroic narratives of frontier life that dominated popular literature in the 19th century, stories of Indian fighters and bear hunters, of men carving civilization from the wilderness single-handed, have their place in cultural history. But they obscure as much as they reveal, creating an expectation that frontier life was primarily about conquest, that the successful settler was the one who dominated the environment through strength and courage. Horoscope's ledger offers a different model: the settler as observer, as student of the landscape, as someone who learned to read signs and adapt to conditions rather than impose his will upon them. It is perhaps a less dramatic story, but it is almost certainly more representative of how most people actually lived on the frontier. The wolves that circled Morozov's cabin were likely a small pack, perhaps 5 to 8 animals, following a seasonal pattern repeated for countless generations before Russian settlers arrived in the region. They came near human habitation in winter because deep snow made hunting difficult, and human settlements with their livestock and stored food represented potential resources. They did not attack because the cabin was secure, the dog was vigilant, and Morozov himself never exhibited the kind of vulnerability, sickness, injury, carelessness that might invite predation. The relationship was one of mutual wariness, each species aware of the other's capacity to do harm, each maintaining a defensive posture. The value of Morozov's account lies not in the exceptional nature of that winter. Surely many settlers experienced similar seasons, but in the sustained attention with which he recorded it, tracking not just the wolves' behavior, but his own psychological adaptation to their presence. Most people who lived through such a winter would have had little to say about it afterward. They might have remembered being afraid, might have told a dramatic story about the night the wolves came closest, but the gradual process of accommodation, the way fear became familiar and then something else, this is hard to articulate, and few tried. Morozov, perhaps because writing was still somewhat novel and difficult for him, perhaps because the long dark nights gave him time for reflection, managed to capture that process in real time. His ledger entries form a kind of psychological map of the territory between acute fear and acceptance, showing how the journey was made not through dramatic leaps, but through small daily adjustments. The February entry where he stood in the packed snow and looked back at his cabin through the wolves' eyes represents a turning point. In that moment, he ceased to view the wolves purely as threat and began to imagine them as creatures with a perspective of their own, a logic of their own. This did not make them less dangerous, but it made them understandable in a new way. They were not demons or monsters, but animals following instinct and need, assessing opportunity and risk according to a calculus he couldn't fully understand, but could at least acknowledge as rational from their point of view. This shift in perception, from threat to fellow creature, is subtle but profound. It does not eliminate fear, but places it in context, makes it something that can be managed rather than something that must be overcome or fled. Morozov never became comfortable with the wolf's presence, but he learned to function within the discomfort, to make decisions and maintain routines with the knowledge that danger lurked at the edge of the clearing. His question in March whether his accommodation represented wisdom or exhaustion touches on the ambiguity of adaptation. Is learning to live with chronic fear a valuable skill or a kind of surrender? Is the ability to function under constant, low-grade anxiety a strength, or the wearing down of a natural protective response? Morozov does not answer these questions. Perhaps there is no single answer. What matters is that he continued to split wood, tend the fire, care for his family, maintain the cabin, and plan for spring. The wolves did not stop him from living. They changed the way he lived, adding a layer of vigilance and awareness to every action. The ledger also reveals something about Maria Morozov's wife, though she appears only through his observations and brief mentions. He clearly shared his awareness of the wolves. She asks him why he is always listening. She sits with him through the long January nights. She notices him keeping the axe by the door, but her expression of concern is practical rather than fearful, asking whether they should be concerned, noting the children's poor sleep, seeming relieved when he decides not to join the hunt. She's managing her own adaptation to the situation while also managing the household and the children's reactions. One imagines she to listen through those winter nights, track the howls and the silences, calculated distance and danger. But she left no written record, and Morozov's ledger gives us only fragments of her experience, filtered through his own. This is typical of frontier ledgers. They capture one perspective, usually male, usually focused on external events and practical affairs. The inner lives of women and children, their fears, accommodations, and understandings remain largely invisible. We can infer Maria's experience from Morozov's comments, but we cannot access it directly. That limitation reminds us that every historical document, no matter how detailed, captures only a fragment of the lived reality it describes. The children are similarly mentioned only in passing. They no longer ask about the sounds. They sleep poorly in December. They become louder and more active when spring arrives. These brief records hint at significant stress and adaptation. Children who stop asking about frightening sounds have likely been told too many times, "There is nothing to worry about," have learned not to seek reassurance. They cope by accepting the situation as normal. This is not a comfortable process, and one wonders what long-term effects such a winter might have on young minds. Did they grow up more alert, more aware of danger, with a deeper respect for the wild? Or did they simply absorb the parental message that fear must be borne silently and learn to suppress their own anxieties? The dog, mentioned repeatedly, serves throughout the ledger as a kind of barometer of danger. With its superior hearing and instinctive reaction to predators, the dog often alerts humans to threats before they are visible or obvious. Morozov's dog moving to sleep by the door, a defensive position, guarding the most vulnerable point of entry. The dog refusing to settle when the wolves are very close, pressing himself to the floor during the February close encounter, turning to the corner to sleep in April when the wolves are gone. These behavioral changes parallel and validate Morozov's own reactions, confirming that his anxiety is not imagined or excessive, but proportional to actual danger. The dog knows, and its knowledge is more reliable than human rationalization. The two neighbors, Pietro and Koslov appear periodically in the ledger, representing different responses to the wolf problem. Pietro, who lost chickens and advocated for a hunt, embodies the aggressive response. Threat should be met with counter-threat. Predators should be killed or driven off. Human dominance should be asserted through violence. Koslov seems less certain, more willing to consider alternatives, but he goes along with Pietro's hunting plan. Their day spent tracking wolves without firing a shot teaches them, on the rows I've already understood that wolves are not easily harmed by casual hunting, that they are too wary, too mobile, too clever to be easily killed by farmers with rifles. Koslov's uncertain laugh as he describes the experience suggests an acknowledgement of this truth, that the wolves controlled the encounter throughout, allowing themselves to be tracked just enough to hold the men's interest, but never coming close enough to be in danger. It is humbling knowledge, and it explains why Koslov did not propose a second hunt. The seasonal pattern Morozov describes wolves arriving with the deep winter, leaving with the spring fits with what is known of wolf behavior in areas of severe winters and migratory prey. As snow deepens, deer and other prey animals become more vulnerable, but also more mobile, moving to areas where food is accessible. Humans follow these movements, and their routes take them past areas that include human settlements. In early spring, as the snow melts and prey disperses into summer ranges, wolves adjust their territories accordingly, often moving away from human habitation. So's wolves, then, were wolves following an ancient pattern, one repeated for millennia before human settlement. That their route brought them near his cabin was incidental to their purposes, a consequence of where he chose to build. Understanding this pattern, that the wolves were not targeting him, but simply moving through a landscape that happened to contain his claim, was part of what eventually allowed Morozov to see them as neighbors rather than enemies. They were there not because of his presence, they were there in spite of it, following needs unrelated to human existence. This realization is strangely comforting. It means their behavior is not personal, not born of animosity or aggression toward humans. They circle the cabin because it is an obstacle on their territory, something to be monitored, avoided, or skirted. As long as Morozov stays behind his walls, tends his fire, and does not venture out into the dark, the wolves have no reason to challenge him. The compact he describes in his October 1813 entry, mutual respect, distance, acknowledgement without intimacy, is built on this understanding. The wolves will do what wolves do. He will do what humans do. As long as neither trespasses on the other's space, coexistence is possible. The ledger ends in 1814 with a mundane note about firewood, reminding us that life goes on beyond dramatic events. The wolf winter was significant, even transformative, but it was not everything. Morozov still had wood to chop, tools to repair, crops to plant, children to raise. The daily business of survival continues, incorporating the lessons learned, but not dwelling endlessly on the crisis. This, too, is characteristic of frontier life. Dramatic events punctuate long stretches of routine, and survival depends on maintaining that routine regardless of what came before. One cannot think about wolves all day when there is wood to split and fields to prepare. Morozov's departure from the settlement in 1821 completed a cycle of frontier experience. He arrived in 1807, built the cabin, established the farm, lived through seasons and years, including the wolf winter, and ultimately decided to leave for the sake of his children. This trajectory was common. Many frontier settlers were motivated not by love of the wilderness, but by economic need or opportunity. They viewed the isolation and danger as temporary conditions, planning eventually to move to a more settled place where children could be educated, or medicine, community, and commerce made life less precarious. Morozov's 14-year tenure suggests he found something of value there, or at least something sustainable. A life that, despite hardship and fear, allowed him to provide for a family and allowed a degree of autonomy not possible in more settled regions. The frontier offered a certain freedom from the social hierarchies, the authority of landowners and overseers, the rigid expectations of village life in towns. That freedom came with the price: isolation, danger, the constant physical strain of labor. But, for many, it was a trade worth making, at least for a time. Morrisop's ledger suggests a man who took that trade seriously, who did not romanticize frontier life but was soberly aware of its benefits and its burdens. The Wolf Winter was part of those burdens. One season among many when the cost of frontier living became particularly visible and immediate. But it was not enough to drive him away. Thought then, he stayed another 7 years, meaning he lived through at least 7 more winters in that cabin, presumably with the wolves returning each cold season, circling, howling, leaving tracks in the snow. That he stopped writing about them after 1813 does not mean they stopped coming. It means they had become fully integrated into his understanding of the place, no longer remarkable enough to record. The extraordinary had become ordinary. The terrifying had become familiar. This is how humans adapt to almost anything. Through repetition, through small, daily acceptances, through the gradual erosion of novelty until even fear can become routine. The historical context of Morrisop's ledger enriches our understanding of his experience. 1811 and 1812 were turbulent years in Russian history. Though the effects of Napoleon's invasion and the subsequent war would have reached the frontier settlement only as distant rumors and occasional demands for supplies or conscripts, Morozov never mentions these larger events in his ledger, suggesting either that news was slow to reach his remote location, or that the immediate pressures of survival left little energy for concern about distant wars. For a man living on the edge of settled territory, the wolves at the door were a more immediate threat than French armies hundreds of miles away. It is a reminder that historical experience is always both local and global. The great events recorded in history books mattered less to many people than the weather, the wolves, and the daily struggle to maintain shelter and food. Morrisop's ledger, with its meticulous attention to the immediate and the practical, gives us access to that local history of lived experience in a way that narratives of battles and treaties cannot. The preservation of the ledger itself carries an element of chance. Many similar documents were lost, used as kindling, destroyed by water or fire, thrown away by descendants who saw no value in their ancestors' scribblings about firewood and wolves. That Morrisop's grandson recognized the ledger's value and donated it to the archive suggests that family stories about that frontier life, perhaps about the specific story of the Wolf Winter, were passed down and retained some meaning. Or perhaps the grandson was simply a careful man who preserved family documents as a matter of principle, unaware that this particular ledger would eventually be consulted by historians and readers seeking to understand the frontier experience. In any case, we are fortunate to have at these plain pages, with their patient recordings, in an age increasingly removed from frontier experience, where wolves have been extirpated from most of their historical range and wilderness itself has become something contained within parks and preserves. Morrisop's ledger offers a window into a different kind of relationship between humans and wildlife. It shows us a time when coexistence was a necessity, not a choice, when the boundary between the human and the wild was negotiated nightly, when fear was not abstract but direct and concrete. Reading his records, we can almost hear the howls ourselves, almost feel the tension of those long winter nights when every sound outside the door required interpretation and response. The literary quality of Morrisop's writing, its restraint, its attention to detail, its emotional honesty is all the more striking because he was not trying to create literature. He was simply recording his days, tracking what seemed worth remembering. That this practical record also functions as narrative, as psychological portrait, as philosophical reflection on the human relationship with nature suggests that lived experience, when recorded with sufficient attention and honesty, can transcend its immediate purpose. Morozov was trying to remember how much firewood he had. He inadvertently created a document about fear, adaptation, and understanding. The structure of his entries, often to minus-sentence paragraphs when stating a fact, one reflecting on it or noting a consequence, creates a rhythm that reflects the practical thinking of a man engaged simultaneously in physical labor and mental processing. Action and reflection alternate, neither dominating, each informing the other. This structure also forces a kind of concision. There is no room for elaborate description or extended analysis, only the necessary observation and its immediate significance. The style suits both Morrisop's limited literacy and his situation, little energy for extensive writing after long hours of physical labor, but space for brief, focused records. Modern readers, accustomed to more elaborate prose and explicit emotional expression, might at first find Morrisop's records to spare, too restrained. But it is this very restraint that gives them their power. We feel the fear precisely because he does not exaggerate it. We understand the transformation precisely because he does not over-dramatize it. When he writes, "I am not sure what this says about me," in response to missing the wolves' presence, the understated admission carries more weight than pages of carefully crafted self-analysis could. He trusts the reader, or more accurately, he was not thinking of a reader at all, just recording the truth as he understood it, letting it speak for itself. The wolves themselves remain mysterious throughout the ledger, as they must. Morozov could not know their intentions, could not comprehend their decision-making, could not predict with certainty what they would do. This unknowability is central to their power in his narrative. They represent everything that cannot be controlled or fully understood, everything that resists human order and explanation. In a sense, they are the wilderness itself made manifest, even voice, form, and an intent that operates entirely outside human concerns. Morozov learned to accept this unknowability, to live with uncertainty rather than demand resolution, and that marked his deepest adaptation. He stopped asking why and started asking how to function while afraid, how to maintain routine while alert, how to exist in a landscape that did not belong to him and never would. The transformation from settler to inhabitant, from owner to guest, happened gradually over the course of the winter, catalyzed by the wolves but encompassing a broader recognition of the nature of frontier life. When the land could be visited by predators every night, when the forest pressed close in the dark brought unknown dangers, a man did not own the land in any meaningful sense. Legal ownership, recorded in a distant office, meant little when the reality involved negotiating with forces that did not recognize human law. This did not make settlement impossible. Morozov and his family clearly survived and carried on, but changed the terms of that settlement, made it provisional and conditional in a way that urban land ownership was not. The cabin provided real protection. The cleared land produced crops. The chicken coop could be reinforced against predators. But none of this represented conquest. Only a temporary settling in. A truce effective so long as both parties, the human and the wild, maintain their respective positions. If Morozov abandoned the cabin for even a season, the forest would begin to reclaim it. If the wolves decided the chickens, the dog, or even the humans were worth the risk of coming closer, the balance would shift. Morozov, writing the October 1813 entry, understood this implicitly, understood that his continued existence depended not on his strength or his right, but on a complex calculation of risk and reward conducted continuously by the wolves. So far, they chose not to challenge him directly. That choice could change. To live with that knowledge that safety could never be guaranteed, that danger could escalate without warning, required a particular kind of courage or a particular kind of acceptance. Morozov seems to have reached the latter, through exhaustion, through habit, through the slow wearing away of the expectation that life should feel safe. Security was relative, conditional, temporary. What remained was attention, vigilance, the steady maintenance of defenses, and beneath it all, the knowledge that one lived on terms set by the landscape, not on terms imposed upon it. This is the wisdom the wolf winner typed, a wisdom that arrived not as a revelation, but as the slow accumulation of nights survived, tracks observed, silences interpreted. The ledger ends, as we noted, without drama or conclusion. Life simply continues, recorded in brief practical entries, until Morozov stops writing altogether. Perhaps the ledger book was full and he never obtained another. Perhaps, as the years passed, the habit of writing faded, the experiences that prompted it fading in memory. Perhaps he simply became too busy or too tired to maintain the practice. We cannot know. The not minus knowing is fitting. Morozov was not a historical figure in any conventional sense, not someone whose life narrative requires completion or whose death requires recording. He was a frontier farmer who kept a ledger for a few years and then stopped, who lived in a place for 14 years and then moved on, who experienced a wolf winter and adapted to their presence, and eventually left them behind. His very ordinariness is what makes his ledger valuable. It shows us how ordinary people faced extraordinary circumstances, how daily life continued in the presence of fear, how adaptation happened gradually without heroism or drama. Morissot's experience was representative, and there is good reason to think it was. And thousands of frontier settlers lived through similar winters, similar adaptations, similar shifts in understanding. Was left no record. Morozov did, and his record survived. Through it, we can glimpse not just his individual experience, but something of a universal experience of frontier life, its monotony and its terror, its isolation and its intimacy with the landscape, its demand for patience, endurance, and adaptation. The wolves that circled his cabin are long gone, their descendants perhaps still running in the now much minus reduced forest. Cabin is gone, returned to forest or farmland, or perhaps the site of a completely different structure now. Morozov himself is gone. His life reduced to scattered records: birth, marriage, land purchase, land sale, death, and this careful ledger of firewood and wolves. But the experience described in the ledger remains accessible, remains relevant. We still live in landscapes we do not fully control, still encounter forces we cannot predict or manage, still must find ways to function in the face of uncertainty and fear. The specifics have changed. The wolves have been replaced by other fears, the literal darkness by other forms of the unknown. That the fundamental challenge remains how to live well in a world that does not arrange itself for our comfort or safety. Morissot's answer slowly formed over that winter, and expressed in his final wolf entry was acceptance without surrender, vigilance without panic, coexistence without self-deception. The wolves were his neighbors, not friends or enemies, but fellow inhabitants of the same landscape, a landscape that belonged to neither human nor animal but simply existed, vast and indifferent, containing multitudes. To live in such a landscape required humility, a recognition of the limits of human control and the provisional nature of human presence. It required learning to distinguish between dangers that could be managed and those that must be endured. It required developing new habits of attention, new ways of reading signs and sounds, new capacities for functioning under chronic, low-grade fear. Most of all, it required patience. The patience to wait out the winter, to let spring come in its own time, to trust that the wolves would leave when their purposes were served. This hard tested patience marked Morissot's response to the wolf winter, and one suspects it marked his approach to frontier life in general. He was not a man in a hurry, not a man seeking quick solutions or dramatic confrontations. He was a man willing to sit by the fire through long nights, listening without demanding answers, observing without assuming understanding. This temperament, so different from the heroic frontier persona celebrated in popular narratives, may have been more common than those narratives suggest. Perhaps most successful settlers were men and women, like Morozov, patient, observant, willing to adapt, able to live with uncertainty and fear without being destroyed by either. If so, then his ledger represents not just one man's experience, but a broader truth about frontier life, one worth recognizing and honoring. The winter of 1811-1812, when the wolves came close and taught one man about the limits of human dominion and the possibility of coexistence, was not unique, but it was recorded, preserved, and passed down, and now, across the distance of centuries, it speaks to us. It reminds us that wilderness is not a backdrop but a presence, that fear can be a teacher, that adaptation is an achievement, that the most profound transformations often happen in quietness, recorded in sparse entries in a worn ledger, noticed only by those who take the time to read carefully and listen for the meaning between the lines. Morozov listened to the wolves and learned to hear not just danger, but complexity, not just threat, but life persisting according to its own logic. That listening, patient, sustained, and ultimately yielding understanding, if not comfort, is perhaps the deepest lesson his ledger offers. In a sense, we all live in various ways at the edge of forests we cannot control, listening for calls in the dark we cannot fully interpret, trying to distinguish between dangers that require action and those that require only acceptance. Morozov shows us a path through attention without anxiety, vigilance without panic, and beneath it all, a fundamental acceptance of the world as it is, not as we wish it to be. The wolves circle and howl. We tend our fires and listen. Spring eventually comes, and we record in our ledgers, if we keep them, the small facts of survival and the large lesson of what it means to share a landscape with forces beyond our understanding or control. Now, let us drift toward a different kind of inquiry, moving away from the individual experience toward the larger questions that someone like Morozov could not answer, questions that remain unanswered to this day. What, exactly, were those wolves doing during the long winter nights, as they circled the cabin, howled at the edge of the clearing, left tracks that suggested intent but revealed no purpose? Here, history becomes archaeology, written record gives way to interpretation, and the physical evidence, or more accurately, the lack of it, creates space for careful speculation. The first mystery is the record itself. When archaeologists excavate frontier settlement sites, they find the usual artifacts of daily life: broken pottery, rusted tools, foundation stones, post holes where cabins once stood. But they find almost nothing that speaks directly to the experience we've described. Fear leaves no artifacts. Listening leaves no residue. The nighttime vigilance of settlers like Morozov exists only in written records, and those are rare, because most frontier families did not keep ledgers, lacked the literacy, time, or inclination to record their inner experiences. What we have are fragments, glimpses, enough to know that something happened, but not enough to fully reconstruct its meaning. Consider what survives and what does not. Wolf skulls might be found near a settlement site, proof that wolves were killed and perhaps kept as trophies or warnings. But the sound of the wolf howled, how it traveled through the winter air, how it resonated differently depending on temperature, humidity, wind direction, how it affected the people who heard it night after night, this exists only in memory and description. And memories fade, descriptions are always incomplete. We know wolves howl. We have recordings now, modern records of these sounds, but we cannot know exactly what those howls sounded like to a man sitting in a dark cabin in 1811. How the acoustics of the log walls and shutters changed the sound. How the psychological context of isolation and vulnerability shaped the listening. That experience is lost or nearly lost, recoverable only through careful reading of accounts like Morozov's and through the effort of imagination to enter a soundscape that no longer exists. There is a branch of archaeology concerned with sensory experience, trying to understand not just what people did, but what they perceived, how they inhabited their environments through sight, smell, and sound. Scholars in this field have studied the acoustics of ancient theaters, how light fell through temple spaces, the olfactory experience of medieval cities. Some have turned their attention to frontier settlements, using computer modeling and acoustic analysis to understand how sound traveled in these environments. What they found is that the experience of hearing wolf howls was highly variable, dependent on countless factors. The density of forest between the cabin and the wolves would dampen or clarify the sound. Air temperature would affect how far sound carried. Cold air transmits sound differently than warm air. The extreme cold of a frontier winter would create acoustic conditions that made distant sounds seem closer, or made nearby sounds seem to come from unexpected directions. The construction of the cabin itself would filter sound in specific ways. Log walls are thick, but not soundproof. They absorb some frequencies while allowing others through. A wolf howling 200 yards away might sound like it was right outside the door. Conversely, a wolf 50 yards away might sound distant and unthreatening. The settler had no way to verify these perceptions, no method to measure actual distance, and so lived in a constant state of uncertainty about how close the danger really was. This uncertainty was compounded by the nature of wolf howls themselves. Wolf howls are not random or purposeless. So, modern ethologists who study animal behavior have documented that wolves howl for multiple functions: to help pack members locate each other over long distances, to strengthen social bonds within the pack, to communicate territory boundaries to other packs, to coordinate pack movement, especially during hunts. But wolves also howl in contexts that are still poorly understood, contexts where the vocalization seems to serve no obvious practical purpose. Sometimes a single wolf will howl, with no other wolves nearby to answer. Sometimes howling occurs when the pack is stationary, not hunting or traveling. Sometimes howls contain variations in pitch and rhythm that suggest something more complex than simple communication, something researchers hesitate, almost reluctantly, to label as possibly expressive, as if the wolf howls partly because the act itself serves some intrinsic function beyond information exchange. If we accept this possibility, many researchers do, albeit cautiously, and the wolves circling the frontier cabin may have been doing something more complex than a threat display or a hunger minus-driven stalking. They may have been announcing their presence, yes, but also listening for a response, testing boundaries, conducting a kind of acoustic mapping of their territory that included the strange new structures humans had introduced to the landscape. The cabins, from the wolves' perspective, were recent intrusions on territory they had occupied for generations. The sounds and scents emanating from these structures were novel, possibly interesting, possibly concerning. The wolves' nightly patrols may have been less about hunting and more about surveillance, about gathering information about these new neighbors and deciding how to incorporate them into an existing mental map of the territory. Evidence supporting this interpretation exists in the more detailed frontier records that survive. Attacks on humans were extremely rare, far rarer than settlers feared. Most recorded wolf attacks involved unusual circumstances: rabid animals, wolves trapped or cornered, situations where normal behavioral patterns were disrupted by disease or injury. Under normal conditions, healthy wolves almost never attack humans, even when people are alone, vulnerable, and theoretically easy prey. This suggests that wolves understood humans as dangerous, unpredictable creatures best avoided or approached with extreme caution. Therefore, the nighttime howling near the cabin was likely not a prelude to attack, but a form of communication. The wolves were telling the humans, "We are here. We know you are there. This is our boundary." That settlers like Morozov found this communication terrifying says more about human psychology than about wolf behavior. But there is another layer to this mystery, one that becomes apparent when we compare wolf behavior across different cultural contexts. In North America and Northern Asia, indigenous peoples had lived alongside wolves for millennia before European settlers arrived. Their narratives about wolves, preserved in oral traditions, ritual practices, and the reports of early anthropologists, present a picture radically different from the frontier fear we've described. In many indigenous cultures, wolves were respected, even revered, but not feared in the way settlers feared them. Stories describe wolves as teachers, as spirits with specific knowledge, as beings who observed protocols and maintained relationships with human communities based on mutual recognition rather than threat. These were not naive or romanticized views. Indigenous people knew wolves could be dangerous, knew they hunted the same prey humans needed, knew they required careful management and respect. But the relationship was fundamentally different from the settlers' experience because it was built on generations of coexistence, on patterns of behavior understood and followed by both parties. When European settlers arrived and built cabins at the forest's edge, they were entering into a relationship with wolves without this accumulated knowledge, without the cultural framework that would have helped them accurately interpret wolf behavior. The wolves approached the cabins because that is what wolves do. They investigate changes in their territory. They test boundaries. They gather information. But the settlers interpreted this behavior through the filter of European folklore and cultural fears, stories of wolves as monsters, as threats to Christianity, as embodiments of a wilderness that must be destroyed or controlled. The actual wolves at the cabin door and the culturally imagined wolves became confused, merging into a single entity far more terrifying than the biological reality justified. This gap between perception and reality is part of what makes the frontier wolf experience a mystery. We have two sets of data that do not entirely align. The objective evidence attacks are rare. Wolves generally avoid confrontation. Most settlers go through a whole winter without any direct, threatening contact suggests the danger was small. But the subjective evidence accounts like Morozov's, the fear recorded in letters and ledgers, the psychological cost of constant vigilance suggests the experience felt intensely dangerous. The threat was real, even if it was largely psychological. How do we reconcile these two truths? Perhaps by understanding that danger and fear are not the same thing. One can be truly afraid in a situation that is not truly dangerous, and that fear has its own validity and impact regardless of the objective threat. The settlers' fear was not mistaken. They were in an unfamiliar land, alone, surrounded by sounds they didn't understand, lacking the knowledge that would have helped them interpret what they were hearing. Their fear was a reasonable response to uncertainty, to the recognition that they did not fully control their environment or understand all the forces within it. Meanwhile, the wolves were simply being wolves, following behavioral patterns that had served their species for millennia, patterns that included investigating new elements in their territory and maintaining awareness of potential competitors or threats. The tragedy, if that is the word, is that neither species had the tools to communicate clearly with the other, to establish the kind of mutual understanding that might have reduced fear and made coexistence less tense. Another aspect of this mystery involves the spatial layout of settlements, and what it reveals about how settlers attempted to manage their relationship with the wolves and the wilderness more broadly. If you look at maps of frontier settlements from the early 19th century, you'll notice something interesting about the placement of cabins relative to the forest edge. Most settlers chose to leave some cleared space between the cabin and the tree line. 50 yards was common, the 100 yards if the terrain allowed. This clearing had practical uses: space for a garden and small plot, reducing the risk of fire spreading from the forest, making the cabin visible from a distance so travelers wouldn't miss it unknowingly. But it also served a psychological purpose, creating a buffer zone, a space where the settler could see anything approaching from the woods. That clearing was an early warning system, a way of buying time, of reducing the anxiety that came from having the forest pressed right up against the cabin walls. The wolves negated this buffer by operating primarily at night, using sound rather than sight as their primary mode of presence. The 100-yard clearing wounds nothing in the dark, when visibility extends only a few feet beyond the reach of lamplight. The wolves could be at the tree line, or they could be right outside the door, and from inside in the dark, there is no way to know. The spatial strategies that worked in daylight visibility, cleared fields, lines of sight became useless at night, and the settlers found themselves reliant on acoustic information they could not fully interpret. Some settlements tried collective strategies for managing wolf presence. There are records of settlers taking turns maintaining a bonfire in the center of a small cluster of cabins. The theory was that a large fire burning all night would keep the wolves at a distance. The archaeological record shows evidence of these fire pits large, centrally located, with more ash than a cooking fire would produce, suggesting sustained use over long periods. But the records also suggest that these communal bonfires were difficult to maintain throughout the winter. They required enormous amounts of wood, meaning more labor for an already strained community. They required coordination and shared responsibility, which worked well early in the winter, but broke down as the cold and isolation made people reluctant to leave their own cabins for watch duty. And, perhaps most tellingly, these fires did not actually prevent the wolves from coming close. They merely altered the dynamics slightly, creating a new boundary the wolves learned to respect, while still maintaining their presence in the surrounding dark. By deep winter, many settlements abandoned the communal bonfires and returned to vigilance based on individual cabins, each family coping with the night in its own way. This mystery deepens when we consider what happened to this knowledge, this heart minus one understanding of how to coexist with wolves in the winter dark in the years that followed. As the 19th century progressed, wolf populations in settled areas declined dramatically. Bounties were placed on wolf pelts. Hunts were organized. Poison was distributed widely. By the late 19th century, wolves had been effectively eliminated from most of the frontier regions where settlements like Morsopes had been established. The nighttime howling that had defined frontier winters for decades gradually fell silent, became memory then legend, then was forgotten entirely by most families whose ancestors had lived through it. What replaced the actual experience of living alongside wolves was a simplified cultural narrative: the wolf as furry minus tail villain, as a symbol of the savage wilderness civilization was meant to conquer. The complexity of the real relationship, the listening, the interpreting, the coexistence that settlers like Morozov learned was lost. Later generations reading the fearful entries in frontier ledgers often interpret them as evidence of their ancestors, bravery in the face of a terrible threat, rather than as evidence of their ancestors' gradual learning process, their slow development of understanding and accommodation. There is a parallel mystery about how the wolves themselves adapted to human presence. Those modern wolves that live near humans behave differently than wolves that have never encountered humans. They are more cautious, more nocturnal, better at avoiding direct contact while still moving through territory humans also inhabit. These behavioral adaptations are learned and transmitted within wolf packs, passed from older wolves to younger ones through observation and teaching. The wolves that circled Morisot's cabin in 1811 were part of this learning process. They were figuring out what humans were, what humans did, what level of caution was appropriate. Their circling, their howling, their careful approaches were forms of information gathering, experiments in understanding these new creatures that had appeared in their territory. Just as Morozov learned about wolves through his winter of listening, the wolves learned about humans through their winter of observation. Both species were engaged in the same project, trying to learn enough about the other to predict behavior, avoid conflict, and share space without constant confrontation. That this mutual learning process felt terrifying to the humans involved does not negate its function or its ultimate effectiveness. By the mid-19th century, in areas where wolves still existed, records suggest a kind of equilibrium had been reached. Wolves kept their distance by day. Settlers tolerated the howling at night. Both sides had learned the boundaries that made coexistence possible. But this equilibrium was short-lived, because human populations grew rapidly, and culturally, the decision was made that wolves should not exist in settled areas at all, that coexistence was not the goal, and that eradication was desirable. We are left with questions that cannot be fully answered because the evidence exists only in fragments. What exactly were those wolves doing on those winter nights? What information were they gathering? What decisions were they making based on what they heard, smelled, and saw? What did the human cabin look like in the wolf's perception? How did that perception change over time as the wolves learned more about human patterns? And from the human perspective, what was truly lost when the wolf howls disappeared from the winter night? Was it only fear that ended, or was there something else? Some contact with the wild, some reminder of human limitation, some connection to a larger world of life that was severed when the wolves were gone. These are questions we can pose but cannot definitively answer. The howling has fallen silent. The wolves have been driven to remote areas where few hear them. The generation that lived through the experiences we've described has passed away. Their immediate memories are irretrievable. What remains are the narratives they left behind, the archaeological evidence of how they lived, and our own efforts to enter their experience through imagination, to hear with their ears, to feel what they felt on those long winter nights. The wolves that circled the cabin remain mysterious, extensively studied by modern science, yet still not fully understood, still capable of behaviors that surprise researchers who have observed them for decades. They are social, intelligent, adaptable, resilient, shaped by evolutionary pressures we can trace but driven by immediate motivations we can only infer. When we try to understand what happened on those frontier winters, we are really asking about the space between two intelligences, two ways of being in the world, to species who found themselves sharing territory without sharing language or understanding. That space filled with howling and listening, fear and curiosity, misunderstanding and gradual accommodation is where the mystery lies. And in the few places where wolves and humans still share landscapes, that space still exists. The old questions remain relevant. The old patterns play out in modified form. Perhaps it is a space worth remembering and studying, because it teaches us something about how we relate to the wild, to the non-human, to the aspects of the world that do not bend to human plans or answer to human needs. The frontier experience with wolves was not, ultimately, about victory or tragedy. It was about proximity, about what happens when two species with their own complex social structures and survival needs find themselves occupying the same land, listening to each other in the dark, trying to determine whether the other represents threat or merely presence, danger or simple otherness. Morozov eventually reached a kind of peace with the wolves, learned to listen without panic, to acknowledge their presence without demanding they disappear, suggesting that this kind of adaptation was possible even when the initial conditions involved fear and misunderstanding. The wolves, for their part, learned what they needed to learn, that humans were dangerous when threatened, but usually content to stay in their cabins. The territory could be shared if boundaries were respected, that the long winter nights were big enough for both species without requiring constant conflict. The mystery, then, is not really whether the wolves were dangerous or whether the settlers were right to fear them. The mystery is how the two species managed to coexist at all during those decades of frontier expansion, how they negotiated a relationship neither fully controlled, and what was lost when that negotiation ended, not with continued mutual adaptation, but with the eradication of one side. Acoustic archaeology gives us fragments, hints, possibilities. The ledgers give us emotional truth, subjective experience, the human side of the encounter. Biological evidence gives us facts about wolf behavior, population dynamics, territorial patterns. But between these sources of information lies a gap we cannot fully illuminate, a space where the wolves howled, the humans listened, and something happened that we can describe, but never fully comprehend. Perhaps that is fitting. Perhaps the mystery should remain mysterious. Some experiences should resist full explanation. Some gaps should remind us that our knowledge is limited, our understanding always partial. The wolves that circled Morisot's cabin, and countless cabins like it, remain, in their full reality, ultimately unknowable. We can study their descendants, read the narratives their presence produced, imagine the soundscape of those winter nights, but the lived experience, the actual encounter between specific wolves and a specific human on a specific night in the early 19th century, exists now only as echo, trace, story passed down, recorded, and preserved against the forgetting that time imposes on all experience. Let us, for a moment, accept this uncertainty. Let's acknowledge that we have reached the edge of the knowable, where evidence fades and speculation begins, where the rigorous historian must stop and acknowledge that some questions lead into a darkness no research can fully illuminate. The wolves howled, the settlers listened, the winter passed, and now, to centuries later, we sit in warm rooms with electric light, with no wolves for 1,000 miles, trying to understand what it meant, how it felt, why it matters. The distance is too great, the silence too complete, for full comprehension. But the attempt still matters, because it reminds us that history is not just about what happened, but about what it was experienced, is not just about events, but about how those events felt to the people who lived through them. In the space between what happened and what it felt like, between objective fact and subjective truth, lies the real mystery, the mystery of consciousness itself, of what it feels like to be alive in a particular time and place, listening to sounds in the dark and trying to make sense of their meaning. Now, let us turn to a different winter, experienced by different people in different circumstances, where wolves were present but kept at a distance, where the nights held other concerns, and the howls of herd it all were filtered through layers of privilege and protection, fundamentally altering their meaning. Not everyone who lived through these winters faced the dark in the same way. While settlers like Morozov pressed their ears to cabin walls and tracked wolf movements by sound and tracks in the snow, there were others, landowners, government officials, military officers, established merchants who experienced winter from positions of relative safety and comfort. Their winters were just as cold, the nights just as long, but the relationship to danger was mediated by distance, by architecture, by having other people to worry about the wolves for them. Consider the estate of a provincial official in a northern province. Let's call him Konstantin Ivanovich Vio, R.O.V. His position afforded him a stone house rather than a log cabin. His property extended over cleared land that pushed the forest back a quarter-mile from his residence. His house was 2 stories high, with a proper foundation dug below the frost line, with multiple rooms that could be closed off from each other to conserve heat, with windows of actual glass rather than oiled paper or wooden shutters. The walls were thick enough that outside sounds entered only muffled, as suggestions rather than direct presences. When VOROV sat in his study on a winter night, a fire burning in a properly constructed, while minus ventilated fireplace, he might hear the wind, but little else. The night existed outside the window as a visual phenomenon, a darkness visible through glass, but not as an acoustic environment requiring his attention. If wolves howled at the distant tree line, the sound had to travel across open ground, through cold air, past the outbuildings where servants and stable hands lived, through stone walls, before reaching his ears, becoming so faint it might be mistaken for wind or imagination. His distance was not accidental. The wealthy and powerful had learned over generations how to structure their relationship with the wilderness. The placement of their houses served not just convenience or aesthetic pleasure, but safety. The open ground around the main house had agricultural uses, yes, but it also created a buffer, a space where anything approaching in daylight would be seen, where sounds would dissipate before becoming truly alarming. The forest was deliberately kept at a distance, managed as a resource, timber harvested from designated areas, game hunted at designated times, but never allowed to approach close enough to become a source of daily anxiety. The OROVE's household included staff whose job was to manage the boundary between civilization and wilderness. Gamekeepers patrolled the property during the day, noting signs of wolf activity, reporting any movement that seemed to trend toward the main buildings. Stable hands closed livestock into stone structures at night with proper doors and locks, structures wolves could not easily breach even if they tried. Watchmen made rounds at dusk, carrying lanterns, sometimes accompanied by large dogs bred specifically for guarding property rather than herding or hunting. These were not the lean, nervous animals that accompanied frontier settlers. These were mastiffs or similar breeds, imposing in size and temperament, trained to bark at anything unusual, but also trained to remain calm and less directly threatened. The presence of these animals significantly altered the acoustic environment. If wolves approached the estate, the dogs would raise the alarm long before the wolves came close enough to disturb the main house, and the staff would respond, lighting fires, making noise, indicating that the property was actively defended, not passively occupied. The result was that men like Vio or Ovi rarely heard wolf howls directly. They heard about wolves from staff reports, from letters sent by frontier officials, from conversations with other landowners about conditions in the outlying territories. But the actual lived experience of wolf presence remained abstract, something that happened elsewhere to other people. For the wealthy, winter was primarily a season of isolation, not of immediate danger. The challenges were social and logistical, not visceral. Roads became impassable, meaning visitors were scarce and communications delayed. Supply chains grew strained, meaning they had to rely on stores laden during the autumn. But those stores were extensive, carefully planned, and included luxuries unimaginable to a frontier family. Root cellars beneath stone houses maintained a steady temperature through the coldest months, preserving food more effectively than the crude storage methods available to settlers. Meat could be smoked or salted in specialized outbuildings designed for preservation, with proper ventilation and protection from pests and scavengers. The winter diet of the wealthy, while limited compared to summer's abundance, was still varied on nutritious preserved fruits, pickled vegetables, smoked fish, salted meats, hard cheeses that improved with age, honey stored in sealed containers, nuts. Malnutrition was rare. Scurvy, the scourge of frontier winters when sources of vitamins ran out, was prevented by consumption of preserved fruits and the knowledge needed to maintain a balanced diet. The interior spaces of wealthy winter residences reveal how insulated they were from the concerns that dominated settler life. Multiple rooms meant he could be managed more efficiently. Some rooms were kept warm through constant use. Others closed off and allowed to cool, opened only when needed. This spatial luxury meant daily life could retain some variety, movement between different environments and activities, rather than being forced into the compressed existence of a frontier cabin where everything happened in a single room. The OROV study contained books, not just ledgers and practical manuals, but literature, history, philosophy, meaning winter nights could be spent in intellectual pursuits rather than merely waiting for dawn. Reading by proper candlelight or oil lamp, with enough fuel to burn for hours without concern for waste, transformed the long dark hours from something to be endured into something that could almost be enjoyed. Some wealthy households made music part of the winter routine. A piano or harpsichord, sheet music, voices trained enough to carry a melody. These created an acoustic environment full of human intention, a counterpoint to the emptiness of the winter night, made of deliberately produced sound. When wolves howled in the distance, they howled under or after or at the edge of human music, their wildness contained within a larger soundscape dominated by civilization. The psychological effect of this containment should not be underestimated. For the settler, the night belonged to the wolves. After dark, human activity diminished to almost nothing, and any sound that emerged from beyond the walls carried weight and meaning because it was the primary acoustic event in an otherwise silent environment. For the wealthy, the night remained more under human control. Conversation continued. Music was played. Feet moved on wooden floors. Doors opened and closed. Fires crackled. All of this created a baseline of human noise, announcing that this space was fundamentally domesticated, civilized, safe. Wolves might exist beyond the walls, but they were distant phenomena, no more immediately concerning than the weather or astronomical events, things to be aware of, but not things requiring constant vigilance. This experiential divide created a profound gap in understanding between the classes. When VOROV read reports from frontier officials about wolf problems, about settlers requesting aid or military intervention, he processed that information without the visceral knowledge that would have given it emotional resonance. He understood wolves as a management problem, requiring policy decisions on resource allocation, not as a source of personal fear or nighttime anxiety. His decisions about wolf bounties, about how much government support to provide frontier settlements, were made from a position of comfortable remove, based on abstract principles rather than lived experience. This remove extended to how the wealthy talked about wolves among themselves. In their letters and diaries, wolves appear as elements in stories, topics of conversation, symbols for discussing the challenges of territorial expansion and the character traits required for frontier life. These mentions have a literary quality, a sense that wolves are being discussed as concepts rather than direct physical presences. The wolves have been troublesome this winter. One landowner might write to another. The word troublesome carries no more emotional weight than talking about persistent rain or unexpected expenses. Some wealthy families kept wolf pelts as decoration or status symbols. Pelts displayed on walls were used as rugs, physical evidence of wolves that had been killed and transformed into objects of aesthetic appreciation. These pelts represent a complete reversal of the frontier relationship with wolves. Where settlers feared wolves as living threats, the wealthy could appreciate them as dead decorations, their danger neutralized, their bodies repurposed for human comfort and display. The pelts became conversation pieces attached to stories of their acquisition, a hunting expedition, a particularly troublesome wolf finally tracked and killed, the skill of the hunter or the cunning required to take the animal. In these stories, the wolf is a villain overcome, a problem solved, never a persistent nightly concern shaping the rhythms of domestic life. The winter social life of the wealthy, when travel difficulties could be overcome, often included discussions about frontier conditions, the challenges faced by settlers, and the appropriate role of government in managing territorial expansion. These conversations were theoretical, debates about abstract principles rather than practical problems requiring immediate solutions. Should the government provide greater incentives to encourage settlement in difficult areas? Should military resources be devoted to wolf eradication programs? Or settlers who complained about wolves showing insufficient toughness for frontier life? Or were their complaints legitimate and worthy of support? These questions were debated in warm rooms, by candlelight, over dinners accompanied by wine and multiple courses, while outside, the winter night pressed against the glass, and the wolves, if they existed at all, remained unseen, unheard, at the edge of the cleared land. The gulf between these comfortable discussions and the reality of frontier life was vast, unbridgeable. It is worth noting, however, that the wealthy were not completely insulated from the harshness of winter or the reality of wolves. They faced their own challenges, experienced their own forms of isolation and anxiety. The darkness affected them too, through the same short days and long nights, had existed regardless of wealth or status. Seasonal depression, later recognized as a real psychological condition triggered by lack of sunlight affected the rich as well as the poor. The sense of being cut off, separated from the larger world by snow and impassable roads, carried its own psychological weight. Letters from family members in distant cities might not arrive for months, leaving people uncertain whether loved ones were well or in trouble, alive or dead. Business affairs could not be conducted in real time. Decisions that should have been made in weeks dragged into months. Opportunities might be missed. Problems might fester while communication remained impossible. The wealthy worried about different things than settlers did, but they still worried, still felt the pressure of winter's constraints. Some among the wealthy seem to have been aware of this gap between themselves and frontier families. Their private writings occasionally reveal moments of reflection, a recognition that their comfort was built on privileges others did not enjoy. VOROV, in a letter to a friend in February 1815, described visiting a frontier settlement to inspect conditions and report to his superiors. He arrived near dusk and was offered lodging for the night in a settler's cabin, rather than attempting the return journey in the dark. His description of that night is instructive. He wrote of being unable to sleep, disturbed by sounds the family seemed to consider normal. The creaking of logs, the wind moving around the cabin, and most notably, the howling of wolves, which sounded much closer than anything he had experienced at his own residence. For the first time, he wrote, I understood why the settlers speak of wolves with such concern. In my house, with stone walls and distance, they are abstractions. Here, with only logs and 50 yards of clearing, they are presences requiring attention. I slept no more than an hour that night, and when dawn came and I could return home, I found myself grateful. I have a new respect for those who endure this night after night, and I am less confident in my earlier judgments about their toughness or lack thereof. Such moments of awareness, however real, remained exceptions. Most wealthy landowners never spent a night in a frontier cabin, never directly experienced the acoustic reality of wolves howling from a nearby tree line, never felt the particular fear that comes from being separated from potential danger by only the thickness of logs and a barred door. Their relationship with wolves remained mediated by distance and structure, filtered through reports and stories rather than direct encounter. The children of wealthy families understood winter and wolves in a way completely different from frontier children. They certainly heard stories. Nurses and tutors from less privileged backgrounds might share tales of wolves, either to frighten or to educate. But these stories existed in the same category as fairy tales and myths, narratives disconnected from daily reality. When these children looked out a winter window, they saw snow and trees in the distance, not an encroaching threat. Their education about wolves came from books and descriptions, not from nighttime listening from intellectual knowledge, not experiential learning. This created generational patterns, with wealthy families maintaining their comfortable relationship with winter over generations, each inheriting not just property and status, but a specific way of experiencing or not experiencing the wildness beyond the walls. As the 19th century progressed and wolf populations declined due to systematic eradication campaigns, the experiential gap between rich and poor regarding wolves narrowed, but only because the wolves themselves were disappearing. Frontier families eventually achieved, through absence, what the wealthy had always enjoyed through distant nights without howling, winters without the constant awareness of wolf presence. But this achievement came with its own complexities and losses. The wealthy, who contributed to wolf eradication through bounty programs and policy decisions, rarely reflected on what was lost, because they had never possessed it. Their relationship with wolves had always been abstract, mediated theoretical, and its ending required no adjustment to their daily lives or nightly routines. There is something unsettling in this gap, something that reveals a broader pattern of how different social classes experienced frontier expansion and territorial settlement. The wealthy made decisions that affected frontier life where settlements were established. Support was provided, how resources were allocated, but they made those decisions from positions of comfort and security that bore little resemblance to the conditions they were managing. Meanwhile, the settlers bore the direct consequences of those decisions. Their nights were shaped by policies made in warm studies by men who had never listened to wolf howls in the dark outside their walls. This pattern repeated in many aspects of frontier life, not just wolves. The wealthy experienced the wilderness as a resource to be managed and exploited from a distance. The poor experienced it as the immediate environment that surrounded and contained their lives, something that could not be ignored or disregarded. When policy discussions turned to questions of how to deal with predators, how to encourage settlement, how to turn wilderness into productive territory, the most influential voices belonged to those with the least direct experience, while those with the most experience had the least influence on the decisions being made. Yet, we should be careful not to oversimplify this dynamic or to romanticize frontier hardship while demonizing elite comfort. The wealthy families with their stone walls and cleared land, their staff and their resources, represented what most frontier families hope to eventually achieve. Not necessarily that scale of wealth, but a degree of safety, a distance from immediate danger, an ability to experience winter as an inconvenience rather than a constant threat. The settlers were building toward a future that looked more like the elite experience than like their own current condition. If all went according to plan, their children would grow up in larger houses on more secure, better minus protected properties, better insulated against cold and predators, and would look back on their parents' frontier years as a difficult time successfully endured. So, the elite represented not just another experience of winter, but an aspirational future, a model of what successful settlement could eventually create. The gap was about not just current conditions, but about the timeline of safety and comfort. The wealthy were already living in the kind of future the settlers were working to build. This temporal dimension complicates any simple moral judgment about different winter experiences. Over time, most settled regions did achieve something like the safety the wealthy had always enjoyed. Wolves were eliminated or driven to remote areas. Settlements grew into towns with better infrastructure and collective resources. Individual cabins were replaced by improved, sturdier houses. The progression from frontier anxiety to settled security took decades, sometimes generations, but it did generally move in that direction. The cost of that progress, however, was borne primarily by those who lived through the difficult early years and by the wolves themselves, whose eradication was seen as a necessary step in the civilizing process. That the wealthy facilitated this progress and benefited from it, without experiencing most of its costs, is a pattern typical of many frontier expansions. There is one last observation worth making about how different classes experienced winter. The wealthy, with their books, music, varied rooms, and ample food stores, could frame winter as a season with its own pleasures and opportunities. The forced isolation could be reframed as a chance for focused work, for reading and reflection, for the kind of sustained attention the busy summer did not allow. The long nights could be social occasions, gatherings of nearby families who could afford to travel even in difficult conditions, parties that lasted all night because no one wanted to start a cold journey home in the dark. Winter balls held in great houses with multiple fireplaces and enough candles to approximate daylight became anticipated events, bright spots in the dark season. For frontier families, winter offered no such compensations. Was simply something to be survived, a season to be endured, not enjoyed, that constrained rather than empowered, that took rather than gave. There were no winter balls in frontier cabins, no pleasant evenings of reading and music, only the nightly routine of tending the fire and listening, waiting for dawn hoping spring would arrive before resources ran out. This fundamental difference in how winter could be experienced and interpreted as opportunity or threat, as a season with compensatory beauty or as unrelenting hardship reveals more than economic disparity. It reveals how thoroughly privilege shapes perception, how the same external conditions can produce completely different internal experiences depending on the resources available to mediate them. Two people could look at the same winter landscape, the same dark forest, the same snow-covered ground, and see completely different things. One sees beauty and romantic sublimity. The other sees danger and isolating despair. Either perception is exactly wrong, but they arise from such different positions that they might as well be observing different seasons. As winter gave way to spring, these different experiences converged slightly. Everyone, regardless of wealth or status, felt relief when the days began to lengthen, and the grip of the cold began to loosen, and the possibility of movement and connection returned. The wealthy emerged from their comfortable isolation ready to resume normal activities, having successfully weathered the season with little disruption. The frontier settlers emerged from a more severe trial, having lived for months in a state of vigilance and anxiety that left marks not easily erased. VOROV returned to his administrative duties, processing reports, making decisions about resource allocation for the coming year. Morozov returned to his fields, began the work of planting and repairs, trying to catch up on all the maintenance winter had deferred. Both men would eventually face another winter, would see the dark descend and the cold arrive, would settle into their respective winter routines. But they would do so from such different positions, with such different resources and protections, that their winters, even if they occurred in the same calendar month in the same geographic region, would remain fundamentally incomparable. The wolves, for their part, viewed all humans as essentially similar, sources of uncertainty and potential danger, creatures to be treated with caution regardless of whether they lived in stone houses or log cabins. Wolves did not distinguish between rich and poor, did not adjust their behavior based on human social status. They responded to immediate factors: the presence of dogs, the scent of livestock, the sounds and lights that indicated human activity. In this sense, the wolves were more democratic than the human society they encountered, placing all humans in the same category, all equally strange and worthy of careful attention. The humans did not reciprocate this democratic perspective. They remained divided by different experiences, different relationships to winter and wildness, different capacities for creating distance and safety. These divisions persisted long after individual winters ended, embedded in policy and culture, shaping how frontier expansion proceeded and who benefited most from the transformation of wilderness into settled territory. So the story of winter wolves is not just about the relationship between humans and animals, settlers and predators. It is also about relationships among humans themselves, about how social hierarchy shapes experience and understanding, about who faces danger directly and who manages it from a distance of comfort, about whose fears are acknowledged and whose fears are dismissed as weakness. Long after the wolves fell silent, the frontier faded into history, and winter nights were aimed by electric light, central heating, and the near minus total elimination of wildness from settled landscapes. These questions remain relevant. The gaps persist in new forms. The patterns repeat in different contexts, and the fundamental dynamics, some experiencing danger directly while others make decisions about it from positions of safety, continues to structure human relationships with the non-human world. Now, as we approach the end of this journey through winter nights, let us carry this awareness. The wealthy man in his stone house, the settler in his log cabin, the wolves in the dark forest were all participants in a historical moment that could not have happened without all of them. Their different experiences do not cancel each other out, but reveal the complexity of any historical moment, how a single event or season contains multiple realities depending on who is experiencing it and from what position. Winter came for everyone, but how it felt, what it meant, what it demanded, differed enormously. And those differences matter if we want to understand not just what happened, but what it felt like, what it cost, to those who lived through it in its various forms. And so we reach the end of this quiet journey through winter nights when wolves drew close, when the dark was not empty but inhabited, when the hours between sunset and dawn required vigilance and listening, and a kind of small, sustained courage that leaves no monuments, no grand narratives, only the records of people enduring what must be endured. Now, on this threshold between past and present, let us pause for a final reflection on the journey we have taken together. We began with the immediate, visceral experience of a single winter night in a frontier cabin. The sounds and the silences, the fear that was not panic but a constant awareness. How the dark transformed familiar landscape into territory of uncertainty. We felt the weight of the bar across the door, heard the howls drifting across the snowy clearing, understood how night of vigilance could reshape a person's relationship with his own home, with safety itself. Then we followed Yakov Petrovich Morozov through his winter of 1811-1812, via his careful ledger entries, watching him move from casual notation to sustained attention to something approaching understanding. His words showed us that adaptation was possible, that fear could be transformed into awareness without disappearing entirely, that humans and wolves could share the wintered arc in a relationship built on mutual acknowledgement and carefully maintained distance rather than on conquest. Next, we drift into the realm of mystery and unanswered questions, into the acoustic archaeology and the gaps in our knowledge about what those encounters truly meant. We explored how the wolves might have viewed the strange new structures in their territory, how sound traveled through winter air, intensifying uncertainty, how indigenous peoples and European settlers brought completely different frameworks to the same animal encounter, creating different realities from the same physical environment. Finally, we turned our attention to those who experienced winter from protected, privileged positions, whose nights were spent in stone houses behind cleared land, whose relationship with wolves remained abstract and mediated, whose decisions shaped frontier life without requiring them to endure its daily reality. We saw how the same season, the same darkness, the same wolves could produce completely different experiences depending on resources and social position. The democracy of winter extended only so far before human hierarchy reasserted itself. These four perspectives: immediate experience, individual narrative, cultural mystery, and social divide together from a picture more complete than any single perspective could provide. They show us that historical moments are never simple, never uniform, always contain multiple truths that coexist without necessarily harmonizing. The winter nights of wolf proximity meant different things to different people, produced different fears and different adaptations, left different imprints on those who lived through them. Now, from our contemporary vantage point, we can look back across the centuries and recognize how much has changed. The wolves that troubled Morrisop's sleep have been eliminated from most settled areas through systematic campaigns that saw their eradication as progress, as a necessary step in the civilizing process. The frontier itself has